Well, thank you everyone for being here. This is the session one organized by ASHA and the Opportunity Funds Program Coordination in order to give the ETAs a better sense of how to bridge the gap between Brazilian writing style and the American essay writing style necessary for their application for American universities. So I would like to welcome Chris Rucker. He's an English teacher living in Brazil since 2008, and he is already working. He's working for the Our Lady of Mercy American School in Rio de Janeiro. So, Chris, without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm Chris, as has been said. I'm excited to be here today. I hope that I can share some interesting information with you all. I hope so. And I'm going to share a little bit about who I am, kind of what I do, and ultimately how I go about that. I'm an English teacher. And so at some point, this conversation is going to turn into something very didactic and hopefully not too boring, but it will turn into that because I do think on some level that the process and having a process is probably one of the best things you can do to help young people be successful in this process. You guys are, I think, a lot younger than I am, and you have one thing in your favor that I do not, is I do not even remember my college application essay. It's been that long, and this was back when you still could lose documents. Now you save everything forever. You open up Google Docs and stuff is just there. But I've lost mine. I have no idea what it was about. So the good thing is you guys, I think, still have that experience of having written yours and hopefully, notes around the people who helped you with your process. So hopefully, you can kind of tune into some of that as I tell you a little bit about my process and whatnot. All right, so beginning. So who am I? As I said, I'm Chris. I've been working at this American school in Rio for some time now. It's been about 8 years. I've been in Brazil for a bit longer than that, but I've been at this school for about 8 years. And, I work with a very specific population here. This is a specifically well-to-do population, people with a certain amount of socioeconomic privilege. And that may or may not be true for some of the students you're working with. But I think that one thing that is true, and I think this is maybe even in the world, is that teenagers are teenagers. And I've encountered types of teenagers. And the types of teenagers who I tend to encounter vary on some, large range of spectrum between those who listen and those who don't. And ultimately, what still tends to be true is that they don't do what you ask them to do. And usually it's a misinterpretation of what you ask, or because, like I said, they want to do what they want to do. And so ultimately, I think this is where having a really strong process can help you help them. It's only through having some kind of systematic process by building, or at least in my experience, building the trust, right? Trust in both the process, trust in you as a person who's trying to help them, and also trust in the fact that you're not trying to change their story, right? Because that tends to be something that I run into. I had a student who I had a really great relationship with, who was a really great writer, who absolutely refused to show me her personal statement for a long time, maybe close to 6 months or so. And only in a couple months before it was due did she show it to me, because I kind of forced her to. And she told me, she was like, I don't want you to change my work. And I told her, I don't do that. I don't change people's work, and of course, like ultimately with working with her and understanding what she wanted and what she was trying to convey, I could help her, show her how she wasn't really doing that within her work, and help her get to that space to produce an essay that she really did enjoy. And then ultimately after that, she came to me with every supplemental essay, et cetera, et cetera. So again, like I say, I think having a really strong process, and that's ultimately where I plan to get to. And so And keep in mind, I'm going to tell you about my process, but I hope you don't think, and I have this idea, and this is a crazy idea, but it's an idea that pretty much anything can work. I believe that if you want to lose weight and you want to eat donuts only, you can probably find a way, right? And so you don't have to follow my process at all. But again, I think the important thing is having some kind of process, some kind of some way of going about things, some kind of philosophy behind you to get you where you want to go. It's going to be the best thing to help get you to that space. All right, so I have like a million things of notes here. I'm like the most chaotic person who you'll ever meet, but so that's why I keep looking over here. So let me tell you about kind of me as an English teacher and how I do things. You don't have time for this, but it may be later as I talk through a process, you can kind of think of ways maybe you can implement some of these things to help you guys be more successful. So as an English teacher, I teach my students in 11th and 12th grades. And so in 11th grade, again, I'm focusing around a lot of different writing styles, but mostly a mix of critical and analytical writing styles. But then we shift in the second semester to really focus on narrative writing styles. And so I have them write a story. And usually it's a story that we read a set of stories, and then they have to take one of the character of one of these stories and construct a story from that. And so essentially the idea is to you let them use creativity, but keep them in a box, right? Because if you allow people to be too creative, sometimes they'll just kind of go off the deep end. But if you say, well, your character has to be this type of character, has to be within this type of time and space, etc., you kind of can let people tend to, do a little better if you kind of limit them a little bit. And then and I do that first, and we work on narrative techniques. We work on different things that we'll talk about later, like things like showing versus telling, all these other elements. And then the second paper they write is a story about themselves, and it's just a story. They have to tell a story about themselves. So why are these two complementary things? Well, ultimately, I'm planning for the first semester of their senior year to write their narrative, their personal statement. And I believe that the best personal statements that I've ever read and seen are based in stories, whether that be a story or a collection of stories that they're telling. They tend to me at least be a bit better, especially because teenagers tend to be philosophical when you give them the opportunity, which never works out. It just never, ever works out. But so it's really that, it's that preparation, and it's teaching them those elements that they need to understand, the narrative arc, things around, like I said, showing, not telling, things like building qualities in themselves, seeing themselves as a type of character, right? So that they can build those qualities in. And also, it's really hard to write about yourself sometimes, right? It's a really challenging thing. And I think acknowledging that with them, and then giving them the space to just try it, right? And tell a story about when you went to Disney, or when you something happened, or you learned something, just giving that space to write, it helps them. So I think, as if you're starting to see, as in your writing process, if you start to see certain things that you think are not becoming productive to their overall writing, maybe, this is one of those moments to kind of break off and like do a side little, experiment or side assignment, like tell me about this thing, right? Tell me about an accomplishment you had. Just like have them do something. I think that's always good, because then you can sit with them with that one piece and say, well, what do you mean by you were sad? Like, tell me about that, right? You can really kind of do that with this like smaller thing, and then that lesson may carry over to the next thing. So that's something to consider. I'm going to build into that later, but this is why I structure my curriculum as I do, because I know how hard it is to do that. So again, crafting a story is very, very challenging. Like I said, I'm going to show you in my PowerPoint a little later ways in which I help them do that. The second portion of this, which will happen in a few minutes, is like the lessons I've learned. And one of the lessons that I always tell the students about is that there is no good story, right? The story is what it is. Like, it's how you tell it, right? And so I think, really working with them to do, because sometimes you'll find students who fall into a space where they say it has to be this one. And it never has to be that one. If they feel the need for it to be that one, then my biggest lesson I've ever learned from this is it's not my essay, it's their essay. So I'm going to help them do their essay the best, rather than, trying to pick a story for them. But another thing that I think is really important in building this trust is talking to them, asking them about themselves, because I think a lot of times young people are unaware of maybe how exceptional they are, right? And they'll choose something that they think, I have to choose this story for this reason or that reason, where if you listen to them and if you can ask them, if you learn enough about them, you can bring up something, or you can tell them, hey, maybe, you told me about that, why don't you tell me a little bit more? Or why don't you write about that? That seems to be something. I think, like, the more you can be that person who is, like I said, going back to that trust thing, the more you can be that person who is there to affirm them in ways, I think you're going to build something more and more interesting. So just keep that in mind. Like I said, this is coming. I'm going to talk more about this coming up. But like I said, I think you have the two types of the range of students, the ones who don't listen and the ones who who listen a lot. But again, you usually won't get what you want. You will not get what you want, and it'll be very frustrating, and that's okay. And that's why I think it's really important to build a relationship. And you guys have this opportunity, right? I have this opportunity with my students because they're my students. I see them for a long time. I've normally known them for a long time before this. And so I'm working with them, having known them. I recently worked with someone who I did not know very well, but I made it a purpose to have as many conversations, just like talking with. And I think it really helped the process go along. When we weren't talking, when I didn't know much about him, it wasn't working. It wasn't working because teenagers also lie a lot. And not necessarily lie on purpose all the time, or lie because they want to, but they'll say, like, again, I was successful or something, or and if you take that if you believe that student who just says that, then you won't really get the full picture. I found out later that this student who was successful in all these classes, like, failed half of them. And not that is actually, that's fine. That is what it is. But like, I had to have more conversations to actually find a place that we could build something. Because what also happens with young people a lot of times is that they're not great liars and they're not consistent liars. And so, for example, you could like lie to yourself and tell yourself you're successful, but you won't actually be able to write a good essay about that because you cannot actually tell that story. It's not true. And it actually won't work. And so, again, I think it's really important to build that rapport. Learn a little bit more about them. Again, you guys are lucky. You're working with students who have been very successful. They're really strong students. But even that, right? I always tell students, the worst thing that you can kind of like rely on in an essay is like that I'm smart. I'm like, oh, so the rest of the people applying to college aren't smart? Like that's awesome, right? Like, yeah, smart. That's the minimum, right? That's the minimum you can be, right? Qualified. That's the other minimum you can be. And so you through these conversations, like I said, I think young people are not aware at how exceptional they are, or minimally the spaces that they can actually build a story that's more true to who they are, not necessarily what your grades say you are or what these test scores say you are, but like some other aspect that may jump off the page, right? And that's really what you're looking for. And like I said, I think these conversations are where you're gonna really find that. All right. So, and please keep in mind, if you have questions, please like stop me, like turn on your mic, ask me a question, put it in the chat. If you don't feel, that's fine. I'm more than happy to answer questions as I'm working through, or get to them as we continue. All right. So now I'm going to shift into, like, again, this other thing about like kind of the things I've come to that I understand. So like I said, the first and most important is that it's their essay and not mine. A couple resources that are interesting for you guys to look at are the universities that offer the successful essays, right? Johns Hopkins has a post 5 successful essays every year. I know Harvard does it sometimes, and other universities do it. I think it's always good. It's good for them as well, young people, but for you guys as well, because I think that I have colleagues who will look at essays and say, I don't like that one, or oh, I like this one, or all these other things. And I always say, like, well, like, that's complicated. Like, you're not the one letting them into college, right? And when you look at these essays, what always makes me feel better is that I usually like let's say if they post 5, I usually like 2 of them, and then one is usually okay. One is like less than okay, but fine. And then one I usually hate. I hate with like a passion. Like, I hate it. I hate the understanding of it. I hate like everything that's there. And so that's great because that person still got into college. And so this idea that me liking something or disliking something like can go out of the window, and I can really just focus on making like helping that essay turn into the best essay it's going to be, right? And like I said, I think it's you should be mindful of if you really feel that the essay is, for example, immature or doing something else that you think may be, a negative thing. I think that like if that's the case, yes, it's important to share, and it's important to like use that trusting relationship that they understand that you're telling them this thing and because you want the best for them. But otherwise, like if you feel like the essay is okay, the topic is fine, then your job is to help turn that essay into the strongest essay it can be, right? And that's, my mentality. A second idea, I have an idea of quantity versus quality. So my thing is write more. Write more. Have them write. Just have them write. I don't know. Again, so I'll tell you about the experience I had when I was a young person. I also got a fellowship when I graduated from college, from my college specifically, to come to Brazil. And we had to write an essay, and I was a pretty decent writer, I felt. And I wrote this essay, and there was a professor who lived in my dorm, and she offered to read it, which was very nice of her. And she read it. She was very nice because I'm like a mean teacher, and so I am mean. Everyone knows I'm mean, and so that's how it goes. But she was very nice and just a great person. And she read it, and she started talking to me about it. We talked for a while. And then afterwards, after this conversation, she took a red pen, and I'm telling you, it was 2 full pages. She crossed in every line out until she got to the last sentence and said, okay, great, this is where you begin. And then we talked about what I had said, and she helped me kind of formulate that and to come up with the story. Why is this important? I think people will write things, and especially young people, and I think everyone, to be honest, but especially young people, they'll write to the word limit. Oh, I'm going to write 650. And how arrogant, right? How arrogant is your 650 words are so amazing that you're just going to leave them there. And so have them write more, especially because those first words are normally getting the ideas out, right? Trying, like, and I think encourage the trying, right? Like tell them, like, show them where you think they could, go deeper, where they could improve, where they could grow, or, oh, this is a perfect moment to include like a deeper story about that thing, right? Like have them write more, just have them write. Like I said, whether that writing be on this document itself or on some other stories, like get them into that practice. Again, I don't know how familiar a lot of your students will be with writing, how, normal it will be for them. My students, for example, this is an American school, they're writing in English all day, but when I really think about it, they're not actually writing all that much. And so I get them writing. My students, I regularly, when they have that 650 words, the ones who I work with, I normally have them write minimally 800 and some people up to like 1200. And because honestly, the story is somewhere in there. It's usually not in the first 650. So that idea, right? Like quantity, is usually the answer, right? Get them writing more. Because then, I always tell them as well, because I'm the mean teacher, I say, you care about your words, I don't. And what that means is I will be the person to cross out like a full page of work and say, okay, that was not necessary. That was important to get you to those next words that mattered, right? And so have them write. I think it's really strong. Go ahead, actually.
I wanted to ask you if you have found that first of all, I appreciate you so much for being a proud mean teacher, because I'm a mean coordinator in this program. I'm proud of that. So have you found that working with Brazilian students, they had any difficulty receiving constructive feedback, but, hard feedback, telling them to improve in a certain way? Or is it easier to give negative feedback to Brazilian students than American students, or is that not the case at all?
Again, I think, I've had so many different types of students. Some are a little bit more agile with how they receive feedback, some are less so. And usually that manifests itself by people just being a little less present, or, not doing things when I ask them to do. And so I don't know, I think it's a spectrum even in Brazil, right? It really depends on the type of student you're working with. And I think this is why building that relationship is super, super important, right? Building whatever rapport you can build with these young people is the most important, especially because, as much as it's not your essay, and that's it's super important that you just understand that, you want their success, right? And you don't want to get into a moment where the type of feedback you're giving pushes them away. And so I don't know how to answer that question specifically, but I think the best way is that relationship matters, right? And for example, if you can tell by working with that student needs to be handled with kid gloves, right? And you need to be that person with them, then be that person with them, right? And if that person skin is a little thicker, then it's okay to be that person. And I think, you guys aren't working with, I'm working with sometimes 10 people, at a time or something. So I'm, and I have, my time is a little different. You guys are, the way you guys are gonna, have, and the number of people you're gonna be working with is maybe much smaller. And so, get to know that person. That's why that relationship really is important, because I think at the end of the day, like, as much as it's a thing about Brazilians or not, because I think, yes, a lot of times in my encounters, but this is mostly with adults, to be honest, but Brazilians tend to be a little more thin-skinned than not. I also work in Rio, and Rio is a lot of a place. So maybe that's also a Rio thing. But I think it's develop that relationship, see what kind of jokes you can make, like see what's going on in that relationship. And then, like I said, think about the feedback you give. Like I said, I'm going to suggest a thing that I do with my students, especially my students who I don't have like this. Like I had this one student this year who, I started working with them almost as a private client. But I did similar techniques that took a lot less time. And I think we're able to get this same thing across. So I'll talk about that in a little bit, but hopefully that answered your question somewhat. Go ahead.
I was going to ask you, Chris, if you ever dealt with students that have writer's block. For example, not last year, but the year before last, I worked with a student. He was a very nice writer. I mean, okay, he was a good writer, not an excellent writer, but by the time he finished his personal essay, he had no energy left for the supplementaries. So he felt he had this writer's block, and I couldn't really help him. And so I had to hand him over to another advisor who he already knew. So because I was really, really busy, and I was frustrated for not being able to help him. We had a wonderful relationship. We trust each other, but in this particular manner, I was not able to encounter such problems.
Kind of. Like I said, I am the mean teacher, so I'm a lot of a person to deal with sometimes, but writer's block. It's like, sit down and write some words, right? And one of the reasons why I really focus on quantity over quality is because just get some ideas out. Like, write something. You don't have to write it perfectly. You can just write something, and then we can do something with it, or you can look at it and say, oh, I hate that, and try again. And I think getting people to put words down is more important than no words down, right? And so it's not that I don't believe that writer's block exists. Of course it exists. But for example, when I get to supplemental essays, I usually work with people in like a different type of way. Especially the shorter essays, like anything, less than 300. We just talk it out. I just say, like, tell me about like what stories you think work here, right? What, I just ask for like the basics of a story, including the basics of qualities you want to show. For example, if people say, why University of Chicago, for example, it's like, okay, like, so that's a 3-part essay of like, just every place does it, right? Why Harvard, why Princeton, why this school? It's all the same. They sometimes say goofy things like, oh, our principles mean, like, it's all the same. But like, so what is it? Go do some research around the university, right? Do the first thing. Go find out the things about the university that you actually are interested in, right? Because people normally say, oh, I want to go to Chicago because that's where the Bulls are. No one has time for that, right? So go find something about the university that's specific and interesting, right? And then, one thing I have my students do as they're doing their personal statement is to come up, and this is going to be a thing I talk about in a little bit, come up with a list of qualities, right, that you think are strong and representative of yourself. And then I have them come up with as well a list of something they want from college. And this is not normally an easy task, but if they do it, and if they have that, then they always have something that they can refer to, right? So for example, when you go back to that why Chicago, and if you want to you want to be a doctor, you know you want to be on some campus for some purpose, you know you want, then you have something you can say. And I think that is usually people's issue with writer's block. They actually don't know what to say, especially at this age. It's one thing to be writing a novel and have writer's block, but at this, they literally ask you a question. You should be able to answer that question. And so if you find yourself, if the student is finding themselves at a space of not being able to answer that question, normally, like I said, it's because they think they're done. They think they have nothing else to say. And if you can be that person to show them, right, well, you have something you want from a college. So go see if those things exist at the University of Chicago. Right. And then if you do, okay, well, tell me about how that works. Right. So that's kind of my process with it. But again, you know, like I think it all goes back to the other thing, which is teenagers are complicated. They're just a lot. Right. And so if they say they have writer's block, they'll really believe that. And it's hard to get them out of that. And so, again, you probably did the best thing you could, because I think that sometimes the answer is to pass them off to someone else, because sometimes I have that same situation where someone is not working well with me for some reason. So I send them to the counselor who can then help. And she has a different way with them completely. And she's able to get something from them. So honestly, you probably did the best thing you could, because, you know, but again, you know, working with teenagers is a lot sometimes is the answer.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Yeah. So, but yeah, I mean, again, I'm gonna give you guys a little bit some things that I think have worked best for me. I have like I said, a little slide presentation. So I'm gonna show you that, and then yeah. So anyone else, are we okay? If you have to ask questions, please feel free. So again, I'm gonna talk about some writing techniques. So for example, what did I do with this one student? What I had him do was, first of all, talk to me, tell me a little about himself or what he wanted, etc. But I started giving him weekly writing assignments. And I told him I didn't really care about length per se. And so first I just had him tell me about himself, right? And then the next one was like, oh, well, tell me about something you're interested in. Just choose anything and tell me, you're interested. And then what I would do was then I would go a little, I would look at the essay, I would focus on one aspect that could be improved, right? If this, for example, why, like a why, or the so what, the significance of this, if he just talked about, this community service project, or if he talked about this game or whatever, I would say, but I don't understand, like, what makes it so important? You told me that it matters, and all you did was tell me about this. So then I would focus on that. And then I would have him either redo it or at least fill in the blanks to make it a little stronger. And then I would say, okay, we learned a new lesson. We learned to add significance. And then the next time I would say, okay, our next assignment is tell me about a lesson you've learned. And I said, but beware, you have to include the significance, right? And then he would, focus on that. And then there would be something else missing, like character development, like a change he went through, like how he was, so they say, okay, so now, right. And so these are things that I think can be very helpful, like in lieu of this idea of like doing an narrative essay and then like a nonfiction narrative essay, all this small writing assignments that get to all the things you need to do for personal statement, talking about yourself, talking about things that matter to you, why they matter to you, those things, coming up with small assignments, getting them writing, and then critiquing that, critiquing the aspects that you need to critique there. I think these are all ways of building that trust, but also creating that feedback cycle that's super important, right? Because if they can say, if you can show them, hey, that's not there, and they can say, yes, I agree with you, and then they can change it, then two things happen. First of all, they already start to agree with you at times. So then you build that aspect of the trust, but they can also start to see over time their progression. And I think if you can show them that your feedback and your help that you're giving them is actually helping them grow, if they can look back to that first essay and look at the third version and look at the fifth version and whatever, and see how much they've changed and how much their writing has improved, that also builds that trust, right? And so that's, doing some and think about that for yourselves, right? Like getting them going on something a little less intense, because one thing that people tend to do is like, oh, I have to do this essay. It's like the essay, right? It's like, oh my God, the personal statement. And it's like, well, what if it's just an essay, right? What if it's just an essay and it's just another essay that you're writing, right? It takes some of that pressure off, right? Because I think, again, going back to Chris, your question, right? I think the pressure is a lot, right? This isn't a huge amount of pressure, right? That, oh my God, what if I don't do it right? What if, there's all that. And so if you can kind of diminish that pressure by having them just write, having it just be another thing you're writing, I think that could be very useful. So that's something I think is good. There's a couple more things that I want to say, but I kind of want to shift. So I'll just say this, right? Make sure that you talk to them as much as possible, ask them questions, especially if you're working with more than one person. Take some notes about them so you don't forget, so that you can kind of make connections over time. Think about that kind of thing. And yeah, feedback is super important. I just really think that's one of the best things you guys can do for them, is like to give them that feedback. And like I said, some of them may be very open to it. Some of them may be less open to it, but I think you'll still get the same, regardless of that, you'll get still not what you asked for. And so really it's that, like, just making sure you're patient in that process and available for them. I think that's going to be it. All right. So now the boring part, the English teacher part. Let's see. Okay. Did that work this time?
It's
Okay.
love it.
Okay. All right. So this was a presentation I made a little bit ago. And again, I modified it a little bit for this presentation, and I'll take a little bit from what I said to try to, add pieces in. So again, I think
Sorry, Chris, sorry to interrupt. Is it appearing for everybody? For me, it's still just loading.
I think we might have the same issue as before, Chris. I think
okay.
we need
Let me
to
see.
share the full screen. Yeah.
Did that work?
That worked. That's good.
Okay. Okay. All right. So the personal statement, right? So again, it's kind of going to go in this format. What it is and its purpose, you guys know that, right? What to do, what to avoid. You probably know most of those things. And there's some tips that, have helped me. And so I think that, the best thing you can do is to, at the beginning, kind of communicate to them what this thing is meant to do. And I think that if, as long as they understand that it's multifaceted, I think, like, if, it's not just about the English, it's not just about this or the other thing, right? A lot of my students, they have this idea of, and I'm going to show you the 3 types of essays to actually avoid, but this essay has to be this or that. But if they understand that it's really about, like, yes, your English, your communication skills, right? Like, they want to understand who you are, right? They want to understand what you've been through, your values and principles, and to, like, a sense of who you are. I always tell my students that everyone is a series of numbers in letter grades and all these things, but this is the one space, right? Or at least the first of, before you get to the supplemental essays, the one space where these universities can get to know something about who you are, right? When I went to college, for example, I remember our first day, there was a lecture, and the dean told us that they had turned away, I think they said 2.5 full classes of people who had perfect scores. Right. And I think, that was what it was, but I think the intention was just to explain that you guys are just more than your scores. You're more than your grades. You may have gotten these grades, or, but you are a bit more than that. And I think this is that place that people start to see that more of that. Right. And I think if you can communicate that to them first, that this is a space for that to take place, then maybe you'll already avoid some of the major traps that the young people will then fall into. All right. So again, like I said, explain this purpose. Right. Another thing that I think is important, like I say, in these conversations, like, ask them what type, to talk to them about themselves. If they, first of all, just have conversation with them, that's important. But then as you get closer to building your personal statement, like, asking them what kind of stories they have, what stories do you want to tell, right? Tell me some things that have happened to you, right? What are some interesting, moments in your life? Having them kind of like chronicle those and have those. And then, if possible, either tell you about them or at least write a little bit about them so that they just kind of exist. One of the things that, is the reason why I do this with my students is because what normally happens at some point is that they either start to dislike that story that they came up with, or just realize that it's just not the one. And then they still have 2 more or something like that. So, and then another thing that these are good for are, and this goes back to Chris, if they have a possibility of stories, then the other ones can also be helpful for the supplemental essays if they don't use them for the main story. So again, I think that is also another thing that could overcome that writer's block. You already have a story, so just tell that story for the supplemental essay. So like I said, like this relationship, right? You guys, you know, in your relationship, this is where you want to push them to think deeper, and not necessarily, right? We're going to look at a prompt, and I'm going to show you kind of how I go about things. But there's this first prompt for the Common App, which says something like, tell us something about your background, identity, or interest that's so meaningful to you that your essay, without it, would be like, you know, missing something. And it's like, I always have to, after I read their work, I always have to ask them. I'm like, well, I don't understand what is so meaningful about this, that without this, your application would be incomplete. Like that, they ask you something very, very specific, and I understand that this is something important, but like, I want you to get there. And so, you know, think about that, right? I always, again, and this is something I'll repeat when I get to that last slide, but one thing I always tell them, I'm like, okay, let's say your talent that you are going to write about is piano playing. How many people play the piano in the world, right? And so if you're just another piano player and you're writing about playing the piano, then how have you talked about yourself, right? And it's not about other people. It's not about differentiating yourself from other people, but it's really about, what is it about being a piano player that speaks to who you are, right? It's that kind of thing. And so really, once you kind of get them moving in a certain direction or really focusing on the story, like really push them to do that, to go deeper with this story, right? To talk about themselves. One thing I always do, and I don't know if I put this later, but probably the first thing I do is have them write a list of 5 qualities that they think they embody. And I always say that, yes, smart, less, and nice, and kind, and great, but let's go with things that, you know, are actually, that mean something, right? And so having these qualities, right, is really helpful to build an essay. Whether they include them all into their essay is one thing, but just the idea that they may be a character, be a person who may have these strong qualities and can use those and build those into their essay can really make their essay stronger. For example, if you're this piano player and you want to talk about how this helps you build determination, or it helps you, or, you know, it shows how perseverant you are, or any of these other things, right? This is how we can build a strong essay. So just something to consider. And lastly, right, drafting. I mean, again, the best essays that I've ever seen are the ones that took a long time to come together. And not time just because they were working every week, but just like they took time to kind of digest the feedback and then improve them over time. And yeah. And rewrite, and then cut, and then rewrite, and then try again, and add and add. So that idea of starting early and continuing, right? It goes back to that idea of people writing 650 words and just assuming that they're done, right? Like, it's rare that that's a possibility. So really, like, get them going early. All right, so what are the 3 types of essays to avoid? I like to call them the bragging essay, the pity me essay, and the action CV resume. So the last one is the easiest one to talk about, because yeah, like, you have an application, you already tell us all throughout your application, all your accomplishments, et cetera. So you're really not adding anything by having this thing of all the things you've done, et cetera, right? Because if your personal statement is meant to be an addition to all that stuff, right, it should be different than that. It's not that it can't be some aspect of that, but just saying all the things you've done, you usually will fall into the bragging essay kind of idea. So what's the bragging essay, and why not that? Well, again, I am amazing. Look at all the great things I've done, right? I always tell students, I'm like, you know, there was a year when, like, it was you or Malala or Malia Obama or whomever. Like, who are you? Who is it that you think you are, right? And yes, I say I'm the mean teacher, so you have to understand it from that perspective. But I want to, like, show them that that's not the way. That is absolutely not the way that you're going to get it, right? And so the idea of just bragging, right, is not going to get you there. The pity me essay. What is this? Woe is me. I've had the toughest life that you can imagine. So I always tell people, my students, this other thing. I'm like, the person who's reading your essay has been divorced 3 times. Every parent of theirs has passed away. They have an ulcer. They have all the things. So they're not going to pity you in all your 17 years of life. That's not going to do it. So it's not going to help for you to just be the saddest sack. And also, you don't get into college for being the sad sack. Like no one has time for that. So again, if you already start from the basis of like, we want to tell a story that shines a light on ourselves without us bragging about that, just like talks about who we are, right? That's the place that I think you want to go. And so this slide is a bunch of chaos, you'll see very shortly, but like, you know, again, talking to them about some of the things in their life, right? Trying to see and asking them these questions, right? Because they may not share all of this information, but if you can ask them about their experiences, about what matters to them, about lessons, right? About challenges, about talents that they have, right? Things that are beyond just whatever accomplishments they've gotten, right? If they've questioned beliefs, right? These are the things that are going to be in hobbies, right? These are going to be the things that really push them to kind of go deeper, right? So again, like I said, those conversations are really super important. All right. So I say my topics to avoid, but there's an asterisk here for a reason. So like, again, as you see, the first three are death, right? Death of a pet, a grandparent, death and grief. Again, what some people call the big game, you know, which is like, oh yeah, I took that last shot and won, right? Big epiphanies or philosophies. But again, there's an asterisk because yes, like I said, as the 17-year-old philosophizing about things normally doesn't turn out okay, right? But, you know, there are things that are possible, but vulgar and explicit topics, right? Simplistic solutions, like you find all these things, right? Just absolute cynicism, just the troubles you have with your parents and problems with teachers, right? A lot of these things can be seen as whiny on some part, or like, you know, or just non-nuanced. But as I say, there's an asterisk here, right? And so why? Some of the best essays I've actually seen are essays around the death of a parent. And I always tell people, don't write about that. And then the ones who do, though, are the ones who can move or who have either processed or are processing the grief and are talking more about themselves and how they work through the process and how they've changed. And so I think that if any of those topics I brought up, right? I mean, again, I would avoid the death of a pet or the death, like, you know, again, like I said, depends on what happens. But, you know, I think some rules are made to be broken. So I think that if you start to notice that there's a compelling story, or if that someone really wants to tell that story, then your job is to help them tell it in the best possible way. And if, again, and I always do this with students, they have had students who come to me and burst into tears as they're telling me their thing. And then on the second time, they're still crying. I say, listen, if you can't tell me, if we can't talk about this without tears, then we probably want to switch topics. Right. And so you really want to gauge that with them as well. Like, is this a topic that's so sensitive that you're not ready to discuss it? Then maybe you're not ready to write it for a university, right? You're maybe not there yet. But otherwise, if you can get them to that space, a space that they can convey something interesting about themselves and how they've grown or how they've changed, et cetera, or the impact that this has had on them, it's, you know, I think anything is possible. All right, so again, it's an introduction to the admissions officials. And again, the idea of just being negative in itself is probably not the best thing, right? I always tell students, you don't walk up to people and, you know, who you've never met before and shake their hand and say, those are some ugly shoes you have on, right? Like, you just want to like introduce yourself, you know, in a way that you project yourself as a person you like to be seen as, right? So these negative ideas are probably not the best ways to go. So again, putting yourself in the best light is the best way. But, and again, this is for you guys to help them do. They may not be able to do that. When I was in high school, I had a teacher. My English teacher was an expert in college essays, personal statements. He wrote literally the book on it at the time, and he offered us, his students, a certain number of classes with him individually, private sessions, and he charged tons of money for this to happen outside of our school. But for us, he gave it to us. And, you know, this is where I learned a lot from this. And like I said, other moments like I had with that professor when I was applying for my fellowship, of people just being open, being willing to listen and provide feedback, right? And so again, think of yourself as that, like the person to help them, right? And so give them the feedback and whatever way you can to make sure that they are showing and highlighting those positive aspects of themselves. So again, like I said, depth. I think it's just in your best interest to push them to go deeper with anything, right? And so whether that be something they're proposing or some aspect of themselves or their interest, like you want them to kind of go deeper with things. So again, in whatever ways you can do that, especially in those early writing exercises, if you can get them to kind of think deeper around the issue, I think this may push them to go deeper in their essays. So, this is the other thing that's really fascinating, right? When you, the personal statement is you telling us about yourself or who, or at least minimally how you'd like to be perceived, right? I was a very angsty and depressive adolescent, and I don't think my essay was that, because I had lots of feedback from people who understood that was maybe not the best way to show myself. And also that was only one version of myself, of course. And so again, this is that idea for you to kind of work with them to let them know. I always tell people, you shouldn't lie. Don't lie in your personal statement. But there's a reason why we call them we like do it in the narrative structure, right? Rarely in life are things as connected as A, B, C, D, and now E, right? But if you can kind of come up with what is the resolution to this story, what is it that I want you to understand from me telling the story, then you can highlight the aspects of your life or of that process that you think helped get you there, even if it didn't happen in that exact order or as you see it. So just something to consider. All right. And again, right? I said this earlier, right? There are certain sensitive topics that I think are worth it to avoid, but it's, every student I've had whose parent had passed away who decided to write that essay, they wanted to write that essay. That was something important. I think it was important in their process of grieving, or minimally coming to terms with it. And I think they were all able to do that in their own different ways. And they were successful in that once they finished, even, they did get into college and that was good for them, but they felt really good when they saw that final essay. They felt that was the essay that they wanted to write. One student, for example, her father had passed away, and she talked about, they both love music, and that was something that they held in common. And it was, it really helped her, like what helped her kind of get over and come to terms with her father's death was this like music, and how she got through it through that. Another student, her mother had passed away, and her mother was very logical, and they had this like kind of logical relationship, but it was through gaining this emotional sense that really helped her come to terms with it. So really, like if that's what they want to do, then I think help them get there, right? All right. So again, like I said, this is where the boring parts happen. So I mean, honestly, it's the simplest thing, but stories have a structure, right? They have a beginning, middle, and end. And this is something that is so basic, but my God, you tell you a story. I mean, you probably heard this. I tell the students all the time. You probably know people in your life who are just horrible storytellers. They're just the absolute worst storytellers, right? And it's because they don't actually have a sense of structure. They'll just start telling you something and they say, oh yeah, and this other thing happened, and they're just throwing things in there. And so, one thing I sometimes do with students is actually like we set up like what is you're in, what is it we want to understand. Sometimes it's better if we have that resolution. If I want you to understand that piano playing helped me become a determined and focused person and push myself towards like higher achievements. Okay, great. Where do we begin then? Right? What is going to be our moment of climax? What's going to be that thing? Right? Where's that moment, that climax? It's the climax for us is the moment of like, both emotional peak, but also a moment of connection, right? With the audience. Like, what can we say as a connection to our audience? Right? So again, really helping them with that. Right? And they have a point. Right? They have a point. And again, like I said, this is one of those things that seems so basic, but a lot of people will just write things. When Ashila asked me about different types of students, I had a student this year who's a really fantastic writer, and she's really great with feedback, and she really likes me as well. She enjoys my feedback. But because of that, she does things that are odd at times. And so we had to talk about that. And one thing she did from the beginning was write a story that was super, super narrative. It was all story, but it had no content behind it. I understood nothing about her when I got to the end of it. And so we, even this person who really liked feedback and wanted feedback could still find herself in that position. So really, really working with them to make sure that they have all of these things in their stories. And again, this is what you all know, right, about stories, but so. All right. So again, quality. So this is what I said. asking them, come up with a list of qualities about themselves. What are these qualities? And I sometimes have them write a little bit about those qualities, not a ton, but just like, what does it mean if you say organized? Like, what does that mean about yourself? What does it mean for you to be organized? That could be a couple sentences, just so that they have a sense of those things. My unit for the senior year is a heroes unit. Like, we do all hero stuff. So we do, archetypal heroes, we do tragic heroes, we do anti-heroes. But we start with the sense of a hero and the hero's journey. And I do this on purpose, right? I do this partially so that they can see themselves as a hero. That doesn't mean that you're the best or these other things, but what it means is that you are a person and type of character who has these qualities, right? And who will face obstacles and can still come out on top in a certain type of way, right? And so I think that idea of having these qualities, like I said, if they have a story and they have qualities, you can do something with that. So try to have them come up with some things that they like about themselves that they think are worth sharing, right? And you can always add those into a story. For example, you can look at a story and say, something's missing here, right? You talked about how you were determined. Like, are there moments in your story that you think that you show where you're determined? And they'll say, oh, right there. I'm like, okay, why don't you talk about that? Why don't you build on that a little bit? How does that show you are determined, right? And through that determination, what does it help you do, right? So think about something like that. Show, not tell, right? Again, trying those early exercises. And again, when they say, I'm sad or I'm X or I'm Y, right? Try to have them build on that. What does that actually look like, right? What does it look like for you to, when you say that thing, right? Like, try to get that with them. Try to do that. Because again, one thing, like I said, it's a personal statement. It's there. So like, for me to be sad or for me to be devastated, like, it's not the same for me as it is for you. So if you're feeling something, right, how can we express that? How can you show me what that looks like, not rather than just tell me what that word is? Again, avoiding cliches, I think is it goes hand in hand with that. So, again, they're going to have cliches and they're going to write them, and that's absolutely fine. But once you have them, try to have them like explain that thing, try to talk to them through that, and then have them make those modifications, right? Again, if the whole point of the personal statement is to be personal to that student, then the cliche, I always tell people, the older I get and the more I learn about life, the cliches are more and more true. However, they're probably true for you in a way that goes deeper than just the cliche. So have them try to have them go into that if possible, right? Like I said, avoid the philosophizing and overgeneralizations. They tend to do this, but have them say, okay, explain this to me. Give me a real situation, right? And then have them put that in there. Those are, I think, much better. And I think this is one of those moments where I think that young people sometimes are like understanding things slightly differently. They think that, oh, I'm gonna make a philosophy kind of moment, and that's gonna be interesting. Whereas I think the people who are reading these are much more interested in them and in the individual story. A good question, right? That you can think like, who is it that you want to be to these people, right? What qualities do you think stand out about yourself? Like asking these types of questions, or what is it your like best friend how would your best friend describe you, right? Those kinds of questions. Having that could also be a strong way, right? And again, I think ultimately this is what helps people, right? Helps you guys, or helps them, I should say, develop this more personal type of essay. So I know that we're getting to the end. I know it's getting late, so I don't want to keep you guys too long. But again, you have a prompt, and I always say, like, once they have a prompt, once they write it, we look, and I literally will cut through each moment and say, okay, right. So you talked about your interests, right? And you've talked about it being meaningful, but you haven't talked about what's made it so meaningful to you. You haven't talked about what made this thing so important that again, none of this is in your application without it, right? So really kind of pushing them to go deeper in that sense, I think. And like I said, a lot of it is just through, I don't think there's a magic. I really don't. I think it's conversations, and I think it's, I think it's conversations, right? And I think it's your feedback, it's your input, it's your, again, taking notes so you can remember that thing that they said 3 weeks ago and say, oh, you remember when you told me that? Do you think that applies, right? So I think a lot of that, okay? And then lastly, like I said, this is all the same thing, right? So drafting and editing are like the thing that makes a strong essay. It's not the writing of an essay, it's drafting and editing, right? I always tell people, I always say, like, imagine the most important and the best athlete you know, and they name him. I'm like, do you think they have a coach? They say, yes. I say, exactly. So you need a coach too. So you're not, again, this amazing writer, right? We all need this help. So again, don't forget, you guys matter, right? No matter what's happening, you guys, your feedback, your, the way you're seeing things really do matter. So I really think, going back to Ashula's idea of people accepting feedback or not, like it's probably even more important for you guys to be agile and adaptable in how you give feedback and understanding these students, so that you make sure that, since your feedback matters so much, you don't want to alienate or isolate people because they don't want to accept your feedback. You want to think, what's the best way I can make sure they hear what I'm saying? All right. Again, your job is to help them write and to help them talk about, right, who this person they are, right? Help them connect to the question. I think a lot of times some people have this mindset that you don't have to answer the question. And I don't like that. As much as I believe that you can break rules at times, I think that answering questions is good, partially because I think that the people who tend to not answer the questions on the Common App prompt tend to just do this long essay that is kind of pointless. So I think having those questions really does keep people on task, right? And I think that's really important. And then again, making sure that they incorporate these qualities that you've learned about them, that you've talked about, into their essay to really make it more about them. All right. My throat hurts and I've talked way too much. And also it got really dark. So let me turn on the light.
Wow, it's certainly a lot of things. Hi, Chris. I was just commenting, it's certainly a lot of things, and a lot of the things you said come into play with the experience I have had so far, and I see the nodding heads from Atula and from Jefferson as well. And some of the things you've mentioned, they go right through with some of the issues I experienced with that student that had a writer's block, but with others as well, and we were just saying that your presentation was so interesting. We're going to share it with other advisors as well. One of the things we did not talk about these guys, but there are a couple of our students who are actually piano players. So they learn they learn to play the piano in other circumstances. And it's amazing to see that although your experience has been largely with students that have a nice income, that have families, the students that we work with that come from low income families, they go through the same process.
Of course, of course.
So teenagers are teenagers anywhere in the world. So I'm glad that we are really on the same page, and I really enjoyed it. I stopped a little just to say how much I enjoyed it, and that I unfortunately have to go now because I have to apply an examination.
Okay.
So it's a hard one, but I would like to thank you so much. It has been such an enjoyable experience, and I leave you in the hands of my expert colleagues, Atula and Jefferson, Benjamin and Sarah. Thank you so much for being here today. And please, if you have questions, this is the time. Bye, guys.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I too.
This truly was so enjoyable, Chris. Thank you so much for the information you shared. I confess we were talking on WhatsApp saying this is actually helpful for all EducationUSA advisors. So we might be spreading it to a larger public even. So thank you so much for the insights.
All right, no problem. Thank you for having me, of course.
So Sarah and
I'm more than happy to answer.
That's what I was going to ask.
Just let me know.
I just wanted to say thank you so much. And I thought it was really interesting. I graduated from Our Lady of Mercy High School in Rochester, New York. So I think that's an interesting connection.
Absolutely.
But, yeah. I guess I'm working with a graduate student, so he's applying to PhD programs. But I guess one of the and like it's still early in the process, so you know, all of that. But his personal statement, do you have any tips for helping condense, because he has written like a lot and he has so much that he wants to talk about, and every time we meet, he doesn't want to let go of certain things, or it's like it's just hard to condense sometimes. I have the same problem, so I don't know if you have any tips for that.
Yeah, so I think that you're probably going to have even tougher than everyone else, because you have someone who's not only just a little bit older, but also both sure in himself and who he is, and also sure in his research and what he wants to do. And so one thing I think is important is, so I don't work with many people who are doing professional studies, but recently I did work with a former student of mine who was writing her medical school personal statement. And so what I started doing, I just started researching. I started researching what a good one looks like, and just like I would have for these. So just honestly going to look, and if for example, if you know anyone who's done a PhD before, talking to them, because I think that, like I said, I think the goal is like trust, right? I think that's always the answer, because he's going to feel how he's going to feel. But if he knows that it's 800 words, or if he knows this, then we know we have to get to that space, right? And then if you can then show or convince or talk to a person, or put him in contact with a person who has done this before, then maybe you'll build that trust a bit more. But I have not found any kind of magical like sauce for like getting people to like break from what they want to do. It's really like it's convincing them to convince themselves of a thing. And so I really think I think that you have to do that research, that outside research, and then because really it's right. If you can show him the right things, right? If you can show successful PhD personal statements, or if you can show like, oh, who normally gets into these types of programs and the type of personal statements they write, etc. And then from there, right, if you can show him that, and he's like, well, every word matters. We're like, okay, well, I didn't see a section around this. Do you think that we can maybe cut this, or do you think we can maybe build on this section? I think if we, I think that's my best advice. But you're gonna have a tough one.
Thank you. No, that's helpful.
I had a question, is if your approach, I'm just assuming that most of the students that you're working with, because they're kind of more affluent and well-to-do, that they're shooting for higher, so to speak, colleges. I was just wondering if your process of working with a student depends on what their target schools are.
I'm not even aware of it usually.
Okay.
I usually only become aware of it because for some people they're applying early, and so then I'm like, oh, when's that? And usually only because, less so because of the date, and more so because they also have supplementals they want me to look at. And then I have to know, because they're very specific to the university usually. But no, I actually don't think any of that matters. I think once one of the things that my colleague, who's the counselor, one of the things we started to look at is that, yeah, you have certain things, like certain schools, especially the, more elite schools, the personal statement weighs very heavily. And then other schools, it may not weigh as heavily, and, but like, none of those things do you have much control over. And so I think that making, the goal is still to have them write the best essay they can write, right? Because at the end of the day, they'll just get in or they won't, right? Because we really have no control over that, right? Like, I think that's the one thing. We had a student this year who was really strong and who got into none of the schools she applied to, and then others who were either same caliber or less, who got into the majority or all of the schools they applied to. So that, I don't actually think it even matters too much, at least in the personal statement category. Yeah, so that usually doesn't figure in to me too much personally.
If I could add to that, I would also say that opportunity fund students are usually applying for highly competitive institutions themselves, because those are the ones that are able to offer them the financial aid they need. So you'll find that your students are looking at some of the most selective institutions, whether it's for undergraduate or graduate programs.
Yeah, so I think the idea, if that's the case, is to like just assume that they're like going like super, to these colleges, and those are the ones that really do look at the personal statements, right? Those, you find that at certain, especially like public schools and other schools that like, or at least this is what I found as in my like little bit of research, that they'll rely a little bit more on grades, or they'll rely a little bit more on standardized test scores. And again, as you see that as these private elite colleges are abandoning, standardized testing and whatnot, they're just relying a bit more on the personal statements and the supplemental essays. And I think, another thing, we're talking a lot about the personal statement, but I really do think those supplemental essays matter, right? You have this thing where like a personal statement is like, I think getting you in the door at this point, I think is really, and going back to Chris's question there about, people feeling like they're kind of done at that moment. It's like, I have this like kind of like freight train mentality, like, let's go until we like finish, like, let's just keep going. Like, we even get to the point, and this is actually, this is something you guys might want to consider. So what I usually have students do is have a personal statement file, and then normally they usually will build, because they get tired of having one document, then they'll make a second and like a fourth and a fifth and a sixth. But I normally have them make a document, a Google Doc that has in order of university and usually by date, but in order of university, and then they write all the supplemental essay prompts, and then next to them they write the word count. And then when they get tired of the personal statement, we just shift and we start looking at the like supplementals, and we talk around those. And so like you just always have time to kind of like, if you're tired of that one, there's something else to do. And so it's just like, I think that's another strategy for kind of working through, whether it be writer's block or fatigue. Like, try something else, like work on something different. That's a suggestion. So I think everybody's done with me by now. It's okay. I'm okay with that. It's okay. No, I'm joking. You guys were a great audience. Thank you guys for asking questions and participating today.
Thank you so much. I cannot thank you enough. And we're so excited that you were able to share this information today. If we have no more questions, I think we'll go ahead and start wrapping up for today. I'm so excited. I think I can speak on behalf of Jeff, Chris, myself, the coordination for the Opportunity Funds program, including Fernanda, that we're so excited to be able to, put this entire team of professionals to work with our students. The program keeps growing. We keep inviting more people to collaborate, to contribute to the students' preparation. And all of you, ETAs, Chris, training ETAs, you're all making a huge difference in these students' ability to prepare, to compete for some, extremely competitive opportunities. So thank you so much for doing that, taking the time of your day, taking the time of your stay in Brazil to do that. That's incredibly, meaningful for us. So without further ado, without extending it so much more, I want to wish everyone a wonderful rest of your day. If you have questions, please do reach out to the coordination of the Opportunity Funds program. We're here to support you. So thank you so much again, Chris.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. You guys are going to be great. You guys are going to be awesome. Just keep that in mind. You guys are going to be great. And then you will be, I promise. All right. All right, guys.
Thank you.
All right. Take care.